Recorded Audiobooks brings you an adapted recording of Dracula's Guest by Bram Stoker, narrated by Alexander Spencer, with the assistance of 11 Labs. This story was first published in 1914, 2 years after Bram Stoker's death. It has long been associated with material omitted from Dracula, and is often regarded as a lost prelude to the original story. This recording has been adapted so that it may serve as an unofficial chapter to the novel. And now, Dracula's Guest.
Chapter 0. Jonathan Harker's Journal, kept in shorthand. 30th of April, Munich. Having some free hours this afternoon before I continue my journey eastward, I took a carriage for a drive into the country round Munich. The sun was shining brightly over the city, and the air was full of the joyousness of early summer. Herr Delbruck, the maître d'hôtel of the Quatre Saisons, where I am staying, came down bareheaded to the carriage, and after wishing me a pleasant drive, reminded Johann, the driver, that we must be back before nightfall. "The sky is bright enough," he said, "but there is a shiver in the north wind that tells of a sudden storm, and you know what night it is." Seeing that I did not understand, he only repeated, with a queer kind of gravity, "Do not be late returning, especially tonight." Johann answered my question in a low voice, crossing himself. "Walpurgisnacht." Then he took out his watch, a great old-fashioned silver thing, and looked at it with gathered brows, as if my curiosity were already delaying us. I remembered that Walpurgisnight, the last night of April, is held in old belief to be a season when evil things abroad have freer sway than at other times. I laughed to myself that such a superstition should linger still so near a great city. The driver, however, seemed quite in earnest, and, out of respect for his anxiety, I let the matter drop, and we drove from Munich at a good pace. Memorandum: ask the Count whether these superstitions are as strong in his own district. Our road led us over a high, wind-swept plateau beyond the city. The country was lonely and beautiful in its way, rolling green, with sparse trees and hardly a house in sight. Every now and then the horses tossed their heads and sniffed the air, and at such times Johann would mutter to himself and tighten his grip upon the reins. His uneasiness puzzled me, for the afternoon was still fair, and we seemed to be the only travellers upon that broad road. After some miles we came to the summit of a long, low hill, from which the country opened suddenly before us. The main road, by which we had been travelling, dipped down the far side of the hill, wound across the hollow below, and then rose again by slow degrees toward the distant horizon. The sun was sinking behind that farther ridge, and the sky there was full of a warm orange light, so that the whole prospect seemed for the moment peaceful and inviting. It was from this height that I first espied the narrow by-road. It branched away from the main road and turned aside into a little winding valley, so that, after the first few yards, it was lost among slopes and trees. It looked but little used, and was somewhat overgrown at the edges, yet this neglect gave it a charm of its own. The grass there seemed richer and greener than upon the open road, and beyond it I could see clusters of wood lying in the hollow, touched here and there by the evening light. The way appeared rather picturesque, and my curiosity was at once engaged. I signed to Johann to stop, and told him I wished to explore that road. At this he shook his head vehemently, and spoke rapidly in broken English and German. "Nein, mein Herr, not that way. It is unholy." He repeatedly crossed himself, and his passionate refusal intrigued me. I asked him why he feared that valley so much. At first Johann would give me no direct answer. He pleaded the badness of the road and the coming storm, and kept glancing from me to the sun, now well down the sky, and back again to his watch. But when I pressed him, he contrived at last to make me understand the substance of the local tale. Long ago, it seems, a village stood in that valley, but it had lain deserted for centuries. Some dreadful thing had happened there. He spoke of the dead rising from their graves, of men and women found in their coffins rosy as with life, and with blood upon their lips, and of the living flying in terror from the place, leaving it accursed to the dead. I do not know whether it was the strangeness of the tale, or the very earnestness with which he told it, or the contrast between his terror and the quiet beauty of the valley below, but his warning did not have the effect he intended. It stirred my curiosity more than my fear. The sun still shone warmly upon the green mouth of the by-road, and the little valley, half hidden and overgrown, seemed to promise just such an adventure as a man remembers afterwards with pleasure. As Johann stammered out his legend, he grew ever more agitated. The perspiration stood on his brow, and he glanced about him as if the very telling might summon some horror even there in the broad daylight. In the end he could only repeat with a kind of desperation, Walpurgis Nacht, Walpurgis Nacht, and implore me not to venture down that road. All this earnest terror over a peasant tale struck me as absurd. I tried to reassure him. "You are afraid, Johann," said I. "Go home then. I shall go on alone. A little walk will do me good." My English blood was up, and I confess I felt obstinate. I even made, in poor taste, a jest that Walpurgis night did not concern Englishmen. At this, Johann grew almost frantic, and slipped back into such rapid German that I could hardly follow him. I pitied the poor fellow, but I had made up my mind. I took my oak walking-stick from the carriage, and shut the door firmly. "Go back to Munich, Johann," I said, pointing toward the main road. "I will return on foot later." Johann hesitated, wringing his hands, but at length my obstinacy, or perhaps his own dread of being abroad after dark, prevailed. With a sorrowful and frightened look, as though he abandoned me to my doom, he climbed again to his box. Turning the horses reluctantly, he raised his hat in farewell, and began to descend the hill by the road we had come to. I stood for a little while at the summit, leaning on my stick and watching him go. I confess that the terror in his face had given me more pause than I cared to own. The carriage moved slowly at first, the horses still restless and tossing their heads. Then it went down into the hollow, crossed the lower ground, and began to climb the farther rise toward the sunset. From where I stood, I could see the road for a great distance, running like a pale ribbon. It was then that I witnessed a curious thing. Far ahead, upon the main highway, near the line where the road met the sky, I saw the figure of a man. It was so distant that at first it seemed no more than a black mark against the orange west. Yet, having once seen him, I could not take my eyes from him. It stood quite still, tall and thin, yet seemed to have something of a cloak draped from its shoulders. Even at that distance there was something in its bearing so singular, so fixed and silent, that the sight of it impressed me strongly. I cannot say whether the figure had just come into view, or whether it had been standing there all the while, and I had only then perceived him. The latter seemed impossible, and yet the figure had the look of something that had always belonged to that lonely horizon. The warm colour of the sunset, which a moment before had made the whole country seem almost cheerful, appeared now to lose its comfort. To my eyes it appeared as though the fading light of the day suddenly turned to a cooler tint as I spotted the figure on the far-off ridge. Johann, being lower upon the road, could not, I think, have seen the stranger at first. But as the carriage climbed the farther rise, it came more directly into line with him. At that moment the horses suddenly began to snort and rear in evident terror. I heard, faint upon the wind, Johann's shout and the crack of his whip as he strove to control them. Then the team broke into a wild gallop. The carriage swayed violently upon the road, turned sharply from the line it had been following, and rushed away toward the right of the open country, the horses seeming beside themselves with fear. I stood and watched them plunge across the vista, with the carriage rattling furiously behind, and a low cloud of dust rising in its wake. For some moments I could hear the diminishing clatter of wheels and hoofs. When I looked again toward the ridge, the tall stranger had disappeared. There was only the empty road, the fading sky, and the long, darkening line of the horizon. This incident was inexplicable, and for the first time left me genuinely uneasy. I regretted that Johann had been put in such danger through my obstinacy, though I trusted he would contrive to stop the horses without harm. In any case, I was now alone, with twilight drawing on, upon a road unused for years. Still, I told myself there was no use in fretting. So, taking my stick firmly in hand, I turned from the open road and went down into the little valley, resolved to find what remained of the deserted village. For a long while I walked on in quiet and solitude. The farther I went, the more desolate the country became. I saw no sign of habitation, not a cottage, not a shepherd's hut. Here and there beside the overgrown road were crumbling stones that suggested former buildings long since fallen to ruin. A few crows circled overhead, and now and again gave tongue. Otherwise I met no living creature. The silence was so profound that the sound of my own footsteps upon the grassy track startled me at times. There was a forlorn beauty in the scene, and under other circumstances I might have enjoyed the walk greatly. But as the sun sank lower, a chill crept into the air. At length I paused to rest myself at the edge of a small wood, and then realized with some concern how late it had grown. The brightness of day was failing fast, and a grey twilight stole among the trees. I determined it was time to turn back toward Munich, village or no village. But when I glanced behind me, the road by which I had come was scarcely to be distinguished, and an ominous bank of cloud had risen in the north. Whilst I stood uncertain, a long-drawn cry floated upon the wind. It sounded for all the world like a wolf. Wolves so near the city, and in spring! Johann had assured me there were none at such a season, yet there was no mistaking the sound, and the hearing of it made me very uncomfortable. By this time I had gone farther than I intended, and was vexed with myself that I had not kept better note of the turns of the road. Though I had a strong desire to retrace my steps at once, my stubbornness still pressed me on, only a little further, to see if the ruined village lay round the next bend. I went forward, therefore, but had not gone far when thick flakes of snow began to drift down. Within a few minutes it was falling in earnest, large wet flakes, which at first melted on the grass, and then lay in a thin white covering over all the ground. The air turned suddenly colder. A distant muttering of thunder came from behind the clouds. I drew my coat closer and quickened my pace, but the road grew more difficult to follow as the whitening veil spread over it. Then the wind rose sharply, and drove the snow almost level into my face, so that I could hardly keep my eyes open. I realized with alarm that I had lost the road altogether, for the hard surface beneath my feet gave place to turf and weeds, and in the gathering darkness and whirling snow I could no longer tell one direction from another. The clouds above were so thick that only now and again a pale glimmer of moonlight broke through. The wolf's cry sounded once more, nearer than before, and seemed to be answered from a distance by others. With every gust of wind the sounds came more strangely, as if unseen creatures were calling to one another through the storm. By now I was thoroughly bewildered. Snow covered everything and still fell in blinding swirls. How foolish I had been! It came over me that Johann's superstitions were the least of my danger. Very real perils of storm and darkness had closed in upon me. The wind rose to a tempest, and I found myself running before it, bent nearly double and using my stick to keep from falling. My fingers and toes grew numb, and every breath cut my chest like a knife. At the height of the storm, a vivid flash of lightning tore across the sky, illuminating the whole landscape for an instant. In that blaze I saw, directly before me, a dark mass of cypresses and yews, a dense grove of ancient trees. Summoning what strength remained, I staggered toward them in the hope of shelter. Then hail began, first in a few hard drops, and presently in a fierce storm of ice which hissed into the snow and rattled through the branches overhead. I plunged into the black shelter of the evergreens just as the thunder broke with a crash that seemed to shake the earth. Within the copse there was comparative stillness. The noise of the wind became muffled, and the hail was for the most part intercepted by the dense foliage. I could hear my own heart beating and my breath coming fast. Reaching out in the darkness, I found beside me a low stone wall. Following it by touch, I soon discovered an opening where a rusted iron gate hung awry. Thus I became aware that I had come upon an old graveyard, and, scarce knowing why, I passed through the gateway. At that moment the wind shifted the clouds apart for a little, and a wan moonbeam found its way into the enclosure. By its light I saw a clearing amid the trees. Snow lay over leaning headstones and tangled briars. In the centre rose a great block of marble, a tomb of considerable size, shining white under the drifting moonlight. It was almost like a little chapel, and had in front a heavy bronze door which stood slightly ajar. Slender black cypresses flanked it like sentinels. Drawn at once by curiosity and by the hope of finding shelter at its doorway, I moved toward it. Above the bronze door was chiselled an inscription. Wiping away the snow, I made it out. Countess Dollingen of Graz, in Styria, sought and found death, 1801. The letters were sharp and clear, as though time and weather had scarcely touched them. Driven through the top of the tomb was an iron spike thick as my arm, which projected upward like some rude lightning conductor. This amazed me greatly, and I went round to the back of the monument, where I found another inscription. In great Cyrillic letters were the words, "The dead travel fast." I knew the phrase, and the sight of it there gave me a disagreeable start. Standing in that deserted cemetery, reading those uncanny words in the moonlight, I felt all at once a most unpleasant sensation. The hair stirred upon my neck, and a sense of dread came over me. For the first time I wholly repented of my folly in coming there alone. This is Walpurgis night, I thought, the night when, if the old tales be true, the graves open and the dead walk. I tried to reason myself out of my fear, telling myself that these coincidences, the storm, the wolf cries, the lonely tomb, were but working upon my nerves. Yet all the same I reflected that a prudent traveller does not lightly despise local warning. My heart beat loudly in the silence, and almost without knowing it, I uttered a prayer. Before I could gather courage to leave the place, the storm, which had lulled for a moment, broke again with tenfold fury. A blast of wind struck me with such force that I could scarcely stand. The ground itself seemed to tremble beneath my feet. This time the hailstones were monstrous in size, and came down with such violence that I feared one might crack my skull. I cried aloud, and instinctively threw myself against the tomb for shelter. The bronze door was recessed, and offered some little protection from the storm. As I pressed myself into this narrow refuge, the door yielded slightly beneath my weight with a harsh creak. It had not been fully closed. There was space enough to enter the crypt. Under ordinary circumstances, the idea would have been revolting. But, battered by hail and half dead with cold, even a tomb was welcome. I pushed the door a little wider. The darkness within was absolute, but anything seemed preferable to the fury without. I was on the point of stepping inside when a flash of lightning turned the night to noonday. In that instantaneous glare I saw, beyond all possibility of doubt, a woman, lying upon a stone bier in the centre of the sepulchre. She must have been lifeless, and yet she had all the bloom of life. Her face was young and extraordinarily beautiful. Her cheeks were full and rosy, and her lips of a dreadful crimson. I had but that one glimpse. The lightning vanished, and in the same instant there came a clap of thunder so appalling and so near that the air itself seemed to burst. Before I could move, something huge and powerful, unseen in the blackness, seized me and hurled me bodily from the doorway. I was flung many feet away into the snow, and my head struck the ground with such force that I was half stunned. Before I could recover, another blinding flash came, and with it I saw the lightning strike the iron spike atop the tomb. There was a fearful explosion. The great marble monument seemed to rend itself apart. What followed I can only set down as I remember it, and even now I am not sure that memory serves me truly. I could only lie and watch, powerless to move, as the tomb split and a tongue of flame shot through the opening. In that ghastly blaze I saw the woman within rise up, her eyes open and her face convulsed with agony. She uttered a piercing scream, such as I pray God I may never hear again. The thunder crashed once more and drowned every other sound. Fragments of stone flew through the air, and the hail descended with renewed fury. Around and above all rose the wild howling of wolves. Half stunned and nearly senseless, I became aware of white vapours or drifting shapes moving through the storm, whether snow borne by the wind or something more dreadful, I cannot say. Out of the darkness there shone for an instant a pair of red eyes. Then, mercifully, consciousness left me. The last thing I knew was of some pale form moving through the storm, and the last sound I heard was the tumult of wolves and thunder blended together. 1st of May, Munich. This morning I awoke in my bed at the Quatre Saisons, safe and warm, and for a moment thought all that had passed in the night had been some hideous dream. It was no dream. My clothes, which had been laid out for drying, and the bruises upon me, are proof enough. I shall set down, whilst the matter is still fresh, and before my mind begins to mistrust itself, such particulars as I know of my rescue. For a time after I lost my senses in the storm, I must have lain in a state between consciousness and oblivion. I remember that I was half buried in the snow, stiff with cold, and unable either to stir or cry out. There was upon me a great weight which made breathing difficult, and I became aware, little by little, of a low panting sound, and of something warm and rough passing over the skin of my throat and neck. When at length I opened my eyes, I saw in the grey of dawn an enormous wolf crouched upon me. Its shaggy body all but covered mine. I could feel the heat of the beast and the vibration of a deep growl within its chest. Its eyes glowed like fire. The jaws were open, and the white fangs so near my face that I could feel the hot breath from them. A terror beyond words came over me. I dared not move a muscle. The wolf did not bite, but continued to lick at my throat in a horrible, caressing fashion. How long I lay thus I cannot tell. My thoughts wandered strangely. At one moment it seemed to me that the creature was keeping me warm, at another that it weighed upon me like a stone. Whilst I yet hovered on the edge of unconsciousness, I heard through the wind the sound of voices, human voices, and saw among the trees a red and wavering light. The wolf heard them also. It lifted its head suddenly and gave a long, plaintive cry toward the approaching lights. Then it sprang from me and moved a little way off. Presently a troop of horsemen came into the clearing, their torches flaring wildly in the wind and casting uncertain shadows over the snow. I heard calls in German as they spread themselves in search. The wolf began to move among the graves with great leaps, and one of the horses, maddened at the sight of it, broke from the line and nearly unseated its rider. There was the report of a carbine, and a shout that the creature was off. Whether it was struck or no, I cannot say. A couple of the soldiers nearly stumbled over me in the snow. I felt hands lift me, and heard one cry that there was life in me still. A flask was put to my lips, and some fiery spirit forced down my throat, which revived me marvellously. My sight grew clearer, and I saw the ruddy faces of several soldiers bending over me, with their horses behind them steaming in the cold. They spoke together rapidly, all much agitated by what they had seen in that accursed place. As my wits returned, I caught fragments of their talk. One kept muttering with staring eyes, "Ein Werwolf, aber doch kein Wolf." Another replied that it was madness to hunt such a thing without blessed bullets and holy aid. Then someone cried out from beside the ruined tomb that there was blood upon the broken marble and some charred matter within. This caused a great crossing of themselves and many ejaculations, of which I could gather little beyond that the place was held to be under a curse. The officer in command, a young man of cool and soldierly bearing, knelt beside me and examined my throat. "He is all right, no puncture," he said in German. "The dog has not harmed him." He laid marked stress upon the word dog, and looked sharply round at his men. One of the troopers gave a hard laugh and said, "A dog! If that was a dog—" But the officer cut him short at once. "I said a dog. If anything else be said, we shall only be laughed at as drunken fools. Remember that we found the English gentleman guarded by a large dog, nothing more." At this there was silence, though I could see enough in their faces to know that none believed his explanation, and that all were eager to be gone. They set me upon a horse, for my limbs would not yet support me, and the officer himself mounted behind to hold me in place. So we rode at a quick pace from that dreadful graveyard, the torches flaming before us. I remember glancing back once over my shoulder. In the fitful light I could still see the ruined tomb, the great spike blackened and twisted, and what looked like a dark stain upon the broken stone. Then the trees closed about us, and all was lost to view. I must have fainted or slept upon the way back, for my next clear recollection is of finding myself at the hotel door in broad day. The storm had passed utterly, and the morning was cold but fair. Herr Delbruck came running out bareheaded, and I have seldom seen relief more plainly written upon any face. I was taken within, and after some rest and a little more stimulant, I learned how the search for me had been set on foot. Johann, it seems, had returned in a pitiable state, half frozen and beside himself with fear, declaring that I had gone into an unholy place. But even before his arrival, Herr Delbruck had received a telegram from Bistritz in Transylvania, signed by Count Dracula, the gentleman whom I am on my way to visit. Memorandum: copy telegram exactly. He showed it to me, and I copied it here at once. "Be careful of my guest. His safety is most precious to me. Should aught happen to him, or if he be missed, spare nothing to find him and ensure his safety. He is English, and therefore adventurous. There are often dangers from snow and wolves and night. Lose not a moment if you suspect harm to him. I answer for your zeal with my fortune. Dracula." This message, so strangely timely, prompted Herr Delbruck to seek military assistance without delay, and it was by means of the search thus organized that I was found. How Count Dracula could have foreseen danger to me upon this particular night I cannot imagine. That he knew of my presence in Munich, and of my intended journey, is natural enough. But that he should send such a warning in advance is a circumstance not easily explained. I do not know well what to think of it. There is matter for gratitude in such forethought, and yet something in the phrase "my guest," and in the singular accuracy of the warning, leaves me with an uneasiness I cannot wholly master. The events of last night are of so wild a kind that, were it not for the bruises upon me and the torn state of my clothes, I might mistrust my own senses. Still, I do not wish to set down more than I know. There was certainly a wolf, There were certainly soldiers, and there was certainly a tomb shattered by lightning. Beyond that I will not be too positive till I have had more time to think. Herr Delbruck urges me to remain quiet till evening, and this I shall do. I hope later to make little enough of the whole adventure to tell Mina without alarming her. At present I cannot. My train leaves tonight at 8:35, and if I am equal to it, I shall go on as arranged. It will be well, perhaps, to turn my mind again to my business papers, but I confess I go eastward with a less light heart than I had yesterday.
This ends Dracula's Guest.